They laughed when they saw him. Blue overalls, old boots, a broom in his hands. Inside a high-security military hangar, officers rushed past an Apache helicopter that refused to cooperate. Systems were failing. Time was running out. Careers were on the line. And no one noticed the old man quietly sweeping the floor. They called him a janitor. They told him to stay out of the way. They ignored him until he spoke. "It's not the software," he said calmly. "It's breathing wrong." Laughter followed. Then silence. Minutes later, the Apache came alive. Perfect, flawless, deadly precise. That's when they realized the truth. The man they dismissed wasn't maintenance. He wasn't staff. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He was the reason the helicopter existed. And what he revealed next would change everything they thought they knew about experience, respect, and who truly holds power. The military airbase was waking up under a pale gray sky. But inside Hangar 3, the day was already heavy with tension. Massive steel doors stood wide open, letting in cold morning air that mixed with the smell of fuel, oil, and metal. The echo of boots striking concrete bounced endlessly through the hangar, blending with sharp voices and the constant hum of machinery. At the center of it all stood the Apache helicopter. Dark, powerful, and silent, it rested like a predator holding its breath. Its rotors were still, its sensors lifeless, its presence both intimidating and frustrating. For hours, technicians and officers have been circling it, running diagnostics, arguing over numbers, and growing more irritated with every failed attempt. "This doesn't make sense," one young officer snapped, staring at a tablet. "All systems say green, but the response delay is still there." Another officer rubbed his forehead. "We're running out of time. This bird is scheduled for a demonstration flight by noon." Voices overlapped. Tempers rose. Rank filled the room. Yet, near the far corner of the hangar, far from the cluster of uniforms and flashing screens, someone else was there. An old man. He wore faded blue maintenance overalls, stained from years of work. A simple cap rested low on his gray hair, and his boots were worn, their soles thin from decades of use. In his hands was a broom, moving slowly, methodically, as he swept dust away from the edges of the hangar. No one spoke to him. No one noticed him. To the officers, he was just part of the background. Another nameless worker keeping the place clean while important people handled important matters. The old man paused briefly, leaning slightly on the broom handle. His eyes drifted toward the Apache. They didn't look curious. They didn't look confused. They looked familiar. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you there?" The old man turned calmly. A young officer, crisp uniform pressed perfectly, stood with his hands on his hips. His rank insignia gleamed under the lights. "This area is restricted," the officer said impatiently. "You shouldn't be standing here." The old man nodded respectfully. "Understood, sir." He stepped back without protest, pulling his broom closer to his side. The officer didn't wait for another word. He turned away immediately, already absorbed back into the chaos around the helicopter. A few soldiers nearby exchanged smirks. "Janitors always wander where they shouldn't," one whispered. Another chuckled. "Probably thinks he's part of the team." The old man heard them. He didn't react. Instead, his gaze returned to the Apache, to the angle of the rotors, the alignment of the sensors, the barely noticeable vibration in the frame that no machine seemed to flag. Time passed. The frustration in the hangar grew thicker. A senior officer arrived, his presence immediately commanding silence. He listened as reports were delivered rapidly, one after another, each ending the same way. "We don't know what's causing it, sir." The senior officer clenched his jaw. "Run the sequence again." "Yes, sir." The Apache powered briefly, then shut down again. "Failure." The old man closed his eyes for a moment. A memory stirred. Not words, not images, but instinct. The kind that comes only from years spent inside machines like this. Not reading about them, not commanding them, living with them. He adjusted his grip on the broom, then took a single step forward. That's when another officer noticed him. "Hey, didn't I tell you to stay back?" The old man stopped immediately. "Yes, sir." "So why are you still watching?" the officer asked. irritation sharp in his voice. The old man hesitated just for a second. Then he spoke softly, "Because it's not the software." The words barely carried over the noise, but they landed hard enough for the officer to hear. "What did you say?" the officer snapped. "I said," the old man repeated calmly, "the problem isn't in the software. It's mechanical, a timing issue." Laughter rippled from nearby soldiers. The officer scoffed. "And how would you know that?" The old man looked at the Apache again before answering. "Because it's breathing wrong." The hangar went quiet. Not fully, but enough for the words to hang in the air. "Breathing," the officer said, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "It's a machine, not a human." "Yes, sir," the old man replied. "But machines have rhythms. This one is off." The officer shook his head and turned to the others. "Ignore him. He's just guessing." The senior officer glanced briefly in their direction, but said nothing. The old man stepped back again, returning to his corner. He picked up the broom, but he didn't sweep. He watched, because deep down, he knew something none of them did yet. The Apache wasn't failing. It was warning them. And if they didn't listen soon, the consequences wouldn't stay inside the hangar. The hangar slowly returned to its restless rhythm, but something had changed. The laughter faded. The casual smirks disappeared. Even the constant arguing seemed quieter now, as if the Apache itself had demanded silence. The old man remained near the edge of the hangar, broom resting against the floor. He didn't move closer again. He didn't argue. He simply watched. Inside the command circle, frustration reached a breaking point. "We've rerun every diagnostic twice," a technician said, voice tight. "Avionics, hydraulics, flight control systems, all nominal." "That's impossible," the senior officer replied sharply. "Nominal systems don't behave like this." Another officer leaned in. "Sir, command is asking for an update. They want a confirmation in 30 minutes. The senior officer exhaled slowly. His eyes drifted, almost unwillingly, toward the far end of the hangar, toward the old man. For a brief moment, he said nothing. Then, almost against his own instinct, he spoke. "Who is that?" A younger officer followed his gaze. "Him? Just maintenance. Cleaning crew." The senior officer studied the old man's posture, straight despite his age, calm despite the tension, eyes locked onto the helicopter with unsettling focus. "He spoke earlier," the senior officer said. "What did he say?" The young officer hesitated. "Sir, nothing important. Just some nonsense. Said the problem wasn't software." "Did he now?" the senior officer murmured. Against protocol, against pride, the senior officer stepped away from the group and walked across the hangar floor. Boots echoed. The old man noticed him immediately. He straightened slightly, resting both hands on the broom handle. "Sir," he said respectfully. The senior officer stopped a few feet away. "What's your name?" "Eli, sir." "Last name?" "Eli is enough." The senior officer frowned but didn't push. "You said something earlier about the Apache." "Yes, sir." "You said it was mechanical." "Yes, sir." The senior officer folded his arms. "Everyone here has years of training, degrees, access to every system log. Why should I listen to a janitor?" The word hung heavy in the air. Eli didn't flinch. "Because," he said calmly, "I've heard this sound before." The senior officer's brow tightened. "Sound?" Eli nodded. "The micro delay in the rotor startup. It's subtle. You won't catch it in digital diagnostics. But it's there." A technician nearby scoffed. "That's impossible. The sensors are reading what they're told to read." Eli interrupted gently. "Not what's actually happening." Silence followed. The senior officer turned to the technician. "Let him speak." Eli took a slow step forward, not toward the officers, but toward the Apache. "I was there," he said, eyes never leaving the machine, "when the first test models behaved like this. Same hesitation, same vibration." The young officer crossed his arms. "That was decades ago." "Yes," Eli replied. "It was." The senior officer's voice dropped. "Then how do you know?" Eli placed a hand on the Apache's outer frame. Not forcefully, almost respectfully, "Because I helped design the fix." The hangar froze. Someone laughed nervously. "That's ridiculous." Eli turned his head slightly. "Is it?" The senior officer searched his face, The wrinkles, the steady eyes, the complete absence of arrogance. What exactly is wrong? The senior officer asked. Eli exhaled. Your calibration assumes the coupling plate expands evenly under temperature change. It doesn't. It never did. On older frames, the tolerance shift was accounted for manually. The technician blinked. That adjustment was automated years ago. Yes, Eli said. And that's the problem. A few technicians exchanged uneasy glances. If you don't manually compensate, Eli continued, the system fights itself. Not enough to fail, just enough to hesitate. And hesitation in the air gets people killed. The senior officer didn't speak immediately. Finally, he said, "Show us." Eli nodded once. Tools were brought, real tools, not brooms. As Eli worked, his hands moved with practiced precision. Not rushed, not hesitant. Every motion purposeful. You learned this in training? The young officer asked skeptically. Eli smiled faintly. I learned this when the training manuals didn't exist yet. Minutes passed. The Apache powered up again. This time, the startup was smooth, balanced, alive. A technician stared at the monitor. Response delay gone. Another whispered, "That's not possible." The senior officer watched the helicopter, then turned to Eli. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Eli wiped his hands and stepped back. "Just someone who remembers why this machine was built." The senior officer straightened, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching now. "You're not maintenance, are you?" Eli shook his head. "Not anymore." "Then why are you here?" Eli looked around the hangar, at the young soldiers, the uniforms, the Apache. "Because," he said softly, "someone has to listen when machines speak." The hangar stood silent. And for the first time that day, the Apache was ready to fly. The Apache's engines powered down smoothly, the deep mechanical growl fading into a calm, steady silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The hangar felt different now, lighter yet heavier at the same time, as if everyone sensed they had just crossed an invisible line. Technicians stared at their screens, refreshing data that no longer showed errors. Officers exchanged looks, unsure of what to say next. Pride wrestled with disbelief. The senior officer broke the silence. "Run the full pre-flight sequence," he ordered. "Yes, sir." The Apache came alive again. Rotors spun with perfect balance. No hesitation, no micro-delay. Every system responded cleanly. The machine wasn't just operational, it was eager. A technician swallowed hard. "Sir, it's flawless." The young officer who had earlier mocked Eli clenched his jaw. "That fix isn't even in our manuals." "No," the senior officer said quietly. "It isn't." He turned toward Eli, who stood slightly apart now, hands folded behind his back. "You said you helped design the fix," the senior officer said. "That's not something you forget." Eli nodded slowly. "Some things stay with you." The senior officer hesitated, then spoke words no one expected. "At ease," he said. The hangar froze. That command wasn't for the soldiers. It was for Eli. Eli looked up, surprised. "I don't wear a uniform anymore, sir," he said gently. "You earned one once," the senior officer replied. "That doesn't disappear." The words rippled through the room. The senior officer turned to the others. "Clear the hangar. I want a private briefing." Within minutes, the noise faded. Soldiers and technicians filed out, whispering among themselves. Curious eyes followed Eli as they passed. Soon, only 4 people remained. The senior officer, 2 top engineers, and Eli. The senior officer gestured toward a table. "Sit." Eli did. The senior officer studied him carefully. "You recognize the Apache like it's an old friend." Eli smiled faintly. "It is." One of the engineers leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, if he was involved in early Apache systems, his name should be in the archives." "It is," Eli said calmly. "Just not where you're looking." The engineer frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Eli replied, "some programs don't leave public footprints." The senior officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Black projects." Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence confirmed everything. The senior officer exhaled. "Then why are you sweeping floors in my hangar?" Eli looked down at his hands. Hands that had shaped metal, calibrated life and death systems, and now held nothing more than memory. Because, he said, I was done being important. The engineer shook his head. People like you don't just walk away. Eli met his gaze. People like me get tired of watching others die from mistakes that could have been prevented. The room grew heavy. How many? The senior officer asked quietly. Eli's voice dropped. Enough. The senior officer leaned back. Command will want to know who you are. They don't need to, Eli replied. The helicopter works. That should be enough. It won't be, the engineer said. Not after this. Eli stood slowly. Then you should prepare yourselves. For what? The senior officer asked. For remembering, Eli said. That experience doesn't expire, and neither does responsibility. An alarm beeped softly from the console. Demo flight is cleared. A voice crackled over the intercom. The senior officer stood. We're flying. Minutes later, the hangar doors opened fully. Sunlight poured in as the Apache was rolled into position. Outside, a small crowd gathered. Officers, technicians, pilots. Word had spread fast. The pilot approached, helmet under his arm. Sir, they say the issue's resolved. It is, the senior officer replied. The pilot glanced at Eli. Who's he? The senior officer paused, then said, someone who remembers why we trust this machine. The pilot nodded slowly. As the Apache lifted into the air, its rotors slicing cleanly through the sky, everyone watched in silence. No vibration, no delay, just power and precision. Eli watched too, but his eyes weren't on the helicopter. They were on the pilot, on the lives that machine would now protect. The Apache circled once, then landed perfectly. Applause broke out, restrained, respectful, almost reverent. The senior officer turned to Eli. You saved more than a machine today. Eli shook his head. No, I reminded it who it was. The senior officer took a breath. Command will ask for you. Eli picked up his cap. Then tell them this. What? The senior officer asked. That the janitor did his job. Eli walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one laughed. And no one forgot him. Because in that hangar, rank had bowed, not to authority, but to truth. The sun was already high when the hangar doors finally closed behind Eli. The echo lingered long after he stepped into the quiet corridor outside, a place far removed from the noise, rank, and reverence he had just left behind. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he had learned that speed rarely solved anything worth fixing. His boots tapped softly against the concrete floor as he reached the end of the hallway and pushed open a side door that led to a small service yard. A battered pickup truck sat there, dust-covered and forgotten, just like him. Eli placed his cap on the dashboard and sat for a moment without starting the engine. For the first time that day, his hands trembled not from fear, from memory. He closed his eyes. The hangar vanished, replaced by another, older, darker, louder. Back when the Apache was still an idea more than a machine. Back when mistakes were paid for in blood, not paperwork. He remembered the first crash. The silence afterward was worse than the explosion. Eli opened his eyes again, pulling himself back into the present. He started the truck. Across the base, the mood was different now. News of the flawless demo flight had reached command faster than anyone expected. Calls were being made. Files were being opened. Names that hadn't been spoken in decades resurfaced. Inside a command office overlooking the runway, the senior officer stood rigid as a video call connected. A man with silver hair and sharp eyes filled the screen. I want to know who he is, the man said flatly. The senior officer didn't hesitate. Sir, his name is Eli. That's not a full name. No, sir. But it's the only one he gave. The man on the screen leaned forward. Then find the rest. Yes, sir. Minutes later, security footage played on multiple monitors. Eli's face appeared again and again, sweeping, watching, fixing. The analyst paused the footage. Sir, facial recognition is incomplete. Records are sealed. The silver-haired man smiled thinly. That means we're looking in the right place. Back in the service yard, Eli drove slowly toward the exit gate. The guard barely glanced at him before raising the barrier. But before Eli could leave, a siren chirped once. A military sedan pulled in front of his truck, blocking the path. The senior officer stepped out. Eli, he called. Eli turned off the engine. Sir, you weren't planning to leave without saying goodbye. Eli smiled faintly. I already said everything that mattered. The senior officer walked closer. Command wants to speak with you. Eli nodded. They always do. Eventually. They want you back, the senior officer added. Officially. Eli studied him. Back where? Advisory role. Design oversight. Authority. Eli shook his head. Authority was never the problem. The senior officer hesitated. Then what was? Eli stepped out of the truck. Being ignored when it mattered. Silence stretched between them. The senior officer finally said, Things are different now. Eli looked toward the runway, where the Apache rested in the distance. Machines change. People rarely do. The senior officer lowered his voice. You saved this program. No. Eli corrected gently. I saved the people who fly it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn metal badge. Old, scratched, but unmistakably official. He placed it in the senior officer's hand. I don't need this anymore, Eli said. But someone else will. The senior officer swallowed hard. You could train them. Eli shook his head. They won't listen to a janitor with a title. They listened today because they thought I was nobody. The senior officer didn't argue. He couldn't. Eli climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, neither man spoke. Inside the command office, alarms of a different kind began to ring. Files unlocked. Names surfaced. A pattern emerged. One analyst spoke carefully. Sir, Eli's been showing up at multiple bases over the past 10 years. The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed. Doing what? Cleaning. Maintenance. Small fixes. The man leaned back. He's been watching. Yes, sir. The man smiled, not with amusement, but with respect. Let him. The Apache sat silent under the afternoon sun. Ready. Not because of software updates or new protocols, but because someone who remembered the past had quietly corrected the present. And somewhere down the road, a dusty pickup truck disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a lesson no manual could ever teach. The road stretched endlessly ahead of Eli, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through open land and fading into the horizon. The pickup truck rattled softly, its engine old but dependable, much like the man driving it. The military base was already far behind him, shrinking into memory with every mile. Eli drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes steady, mind quiet. For the first time in years, there was nothing pulling him back. He stopped at a small roadside diner as dusk settled in. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. A few truckers sat in silence, tired faces staring into plates. Eli took a seat by the window. The waitress poured him coffee without asking. Long day, she said. Eli nodded. Long life. She smiled kindly and walked away. As he stared out at the darkening sky, Eli's thoughts drifted, not to the hangar, not to the officers, but to the pilots, the young men and women who would climb into machines like the Apache, trusting them with their lives, trusting that every bolt, every line of code, every unseen decision had been made correctly. He had once carried that same weight. He remembered standing on a runway decades earlier, helmet under his arm, listening to engineers argue while a pilot waited. Back then, he had fought for fixes no one wanted to approve. Too expensive, too slow, too old-fashioned. Until someone died. The memory tightened his chest. Eli finished his coffee and left cash on the table. Back at the base, night had fallen. Inside Hangar 3, the Apache sat illuminated under bright lights. Technicians moved around it carefully now, not hurried, not careless. Different. The senior officer watched from a distance. He changed the room, one engineer said quietly. He changed the way we think, another replied. The senior officer nodded. Then let's not forget it. A new directive was issued that night. Unofficial but powerful. Experienced eyes would be listened to. Assumptions would be questioned. Silence would no longer be mistaken for ignorance. No one wrote Eli's name on it. They didn't need to. Days passed. Weeks. Somewhere between two small towns, Eli parked his truck near an airfield barely marked on any map. He watched a training helicopter take off, not an Apache, just a simple craft, wobbling slightly as it climbed. He smiled. Later that week, a junior engineer at a distant base paused during a system check. "This vibration feels wrong," she said. Her supervisor almost dismissed it. Almost. But then he remembered a story, one about a janitor, a broom, and an Apache that refused to fly until someone listened. "Check it again," he said. Lives were saved without anyone ever knowing why. Eli continued moving. Sometimes he stayed a week, sometimes a day. He never fixed things directly again, not like before. He just asked questions, listened, watched. When someone dismissed him, he didn't argue. He waited, because he knew time had a way of revealing the truth. One morning, parked on a hill overlooking a runway, Eli heard the unmistakable sound of rotors, deep, controlled, alive. An Apache rose into the sky. Perfect. Eli removed his cap and held it against his chest. "Fly safe," he whispered. Far away, in a quiet office, the silver-haired man closed a classified file and slid it into a locked drawer. On the cover was a single word: resolved. He looked at the photograph and sighed. An old man in blue overalls standing beside an Apache. No rank, no title, just truth. The man leaned back and smiled faintly. "Some heroes," he said to the empty room, "are only visible when we stop looking for them." As the Apache disappeared into the clouds, Eli started his truck once more. He didn't know where he'd stop next. He didn't need to, because wherever machines carried lives, experience would always matter. And somewhere, unnoticed and uncelebrated, a man who once shaped the sky continued to protect it, not with commands, but with quiet wisdom. The end.